No, for nearly three-quarters of a century, the forces of the right and corporate America have counted on fear of socialism as a way to prevent a full dialogue of the issues from left to right on the political spectrum, and it worked incredibly well during the Cold War. It worked surprisingly well in the decades following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the first Cold War, anyway. But it doesn't seem to be working so well anymore. And here to talk to us about that now is Julia Mead. Julia, among other things, is a fact checker for New York Magazine, and she is the author of a recent piece in The Nation entitled "Why Millennials Aren't Afraid of Socialism." So first of all, Julia, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, and let me ask you a question. The subtitle, which I know we don't usually write our subheadings when we're published, but kind of a good summary. It says, it's an old idea, but the people who will make it happen are young and tired of the unequal world they've inherited. Good summary of your piece, you think?
Yeah, I think it's actually a very good summary of my piece. I was really pleased with the headline and teaser that they chose for it.
So basically, you're young yourself, you're a recent college graduate, and you start out by pointing to a BuzzFeed article that says the liberal world order is nearly over and the age of populism is here. But populism, of course, is an ambiguous phrase that can be applied to the right or the left. So first of all, do you agree that the liberal world order is dead?
One of the reasons I chose that as the lead is because I thought it was hyperbolic in a really funny way. No, I don't think that the liberal world order is dead. We still have the European Union and the United Nations, and the United States is still a liberal democracy. But I think that it is being undermined in some pretty serious ways, and I think that people feel a significant geopolitical shift with the election of Trump and with Brexit, to name a few. So I think that it may not be dead, but I think that
it's under
maybe
attack.
On its way out.
Yeah, it's under attack. It needs to evolve. I think we can agree on that. But I think your basic premise is that, especially in this country, people who say that that it's inevitably or likely to be replaced by the right are missing the point entirely, right?
Oh, yeah. I think that is one of the central arguments that I tried to make, or that people who see themselves as being in the center or even kind of liberal should not resign themselves to the end of liberalism as a bad thing, and that there is a really, I think, viable socialist alternative.
Yeah, let's define our terms for a second, Julia Mead. For example, when I talk about liberalism and the liberal world order, to use that rather colorful phrase, it's a little conspiratorial sounding, but what I think they mean by that is, what we sometimes call neoliberal world order, the idea that, bank deregulation and, that there's a financial elite that should be given unbridled access to global markets and in other words, the kind of Bill Clinton policies of the 1990s. That's what I think. And I think that order has essentially proven not to work and is losing its political appeal to a lot of people. And from what I see in the polls, especially losing its appeal to millennials. So, and why wouldn't it? Because it's an order that you say in your piece, you're 22, it's an order that has failed you guys completely, as far as I can tell. The job market is still weak, student debt, massive student debt, and so on. So, but when we talk about replacing it with socialism, what does that word mean to you?
People, that's always one of the first questions I get asked, especially by real grown-ups, because I think that they expect me to say Bernie Sanders. But what socialism means for me is an economic and political system in which, like, the means of production, to be very Marxist about it, factories and services and that sort of thing, are owned by the government and by people rather than by private interests. So it's really a shift in ownership that I think is at the root of this, and that has been represented by the most progressive wing of the Democratic Party, like recently Bernie Sanders, and I think that it would make our country look really different. But when I think of socialism, I think of it in a really kind of technical sense, as as an alternative to capitalism.
So you're actually thinking of public ownership of some of the means of production. I mean, there's a kind of spectrum of ideas here, but one of the things that's striking about the new movement towards socialism is that the Democratic Party for decades not only didn't support the notion of, let's say, privatizing certain functions or certain economic activities, of making them public, of socializing them, but actually actively stood for the notion that we should privatize some of the things government does already. So you had a Democratic Party that was actually under the centrist wing that's been dominant for several decades, been pushing in the other direction. So that really changed. I mean, you give Bernie Sanders some credit for changing this here, and Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. And by the way, I can't resist quoting you now, Julia, where you say, it's kind of funny if you think about it. You probably knew this was coming up in this conversation. The two most prominent politicians to galvanize young people in the United States and the United Kingdom over the last year are old white dudes. Sanders and Corbyn both look like my dad, except even older and less cool. First of all, how did your dad take it?
Oh, my dad loved it.
Yeah.
I've been telling everybody.
Yeah. And let me run for, first of all, I worked for Bernie Sanders during his campaign. And I have a theory about I think it's his policies that mostly galvanize young people, but I have a theory that one of the reasons why it went so well is that you could tell, because he was old, and even by my ancient standards, he's kind of old, because he was old and because he didn't worry about, the grooming and all, perfect grooming that you're supposed to have as a politician and everything, they used a little disheveled or whatever, that everything that came across from him, from the bluntness of what he had to say and the directness of it, to the fact that he called himself a democratic socialist, to the fact just the way he looked was just like, I'm not BSing you. And I think that people respond. What do you think? Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I mean, I think people are really drawn to his authenticity, especially in the primary, contrasted with Hillary Clinton, who, one of the biggest criticisms of her is that she seems inauthentic or disingenuous. So, yeah, I agree with that.
So now, and you say that these guys, Corbyn in the UK and Bernie here, galvanized young people. The big debate that's going on now is, was that a one-time thing, or do you think that people, younger people that anyway, are still galvanized or will carry that energy forward this year and next year and so on?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question of the moment, and I don't know if it's been decided yet, but I will say, I predict that energy is not going to dissipate. I actually, on Tuesday, I went to my first Democratic Socialists of America meeting, DSA, which I cite in the piece as an organization that's grown by over 4,000 members since the election. And Bernie did shed some light on it and brought it to national prominence. And I was in the room, and it overflowed. They had to have a second meeting across the street for new members because it was so popular. So I get a palpable sense that that energy is not going to be lost, especially since the stakes are so high with Trump as our incoming president. People are scared and want to take radical action, I think.
So as you look back, Julia, let's say to your college days, to say when you were sophomore or junior before Bernie came along, is this is a new energy to you, right? This feels like a new thing between Bernie and then the threat of Trump coming in?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I would date it a little farther back even, probably to 2011 with Occupy Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the birth of like a new radical consciousness. But I think that Bernie was maybe the first candidate in the national election that was able to really capitalize on that. That's maybe the wrong word. Well, maybe not. I mean, well,
socialize on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that the culture was brimming with some more radical ways of thinking before this election, but Bernie was able to pull in people who hadn't been politicized before, I think.
Well, I will say, as an aside, it's incredibly encouraging. I remember talking with Bernie, I think it was March of 2015, before he even announced he was running. And, the big fear was, would people respond to these ideas? Because if they didn't, it might make people think that left ideas are not popular in this country. So the fact that they've responded incredibly, 1,000% more than anyone predicted, has been fantastic. I guess the last question for you, Julia, do you see this energy going into revitalizing the Democratic Party and moving it to the left? Do you see it going into a third party, to independent movements that are issue-based? From your sense of it, talking to people and so on, where would you predict this energy goes?
My gut says that most of this energy will probably be directed to organizing outside of the Democratic Party. That's my intuition. I think especially because people have energy right now and there are no elections coming up. So if it were to be funneled into reforming the Democratic Party, I think it would lose momentum really easily. And also, I'm a registered Democrat, I will say that, but I am not emotionally attached to the Democratic Party. I don't feel any real loyalty to it, and I think a lot of my peers are the same way, and we want to do something and be a part of something that feels like it's ours.
So if you have, I think that's a great answer, and by the way, I kind of tend to feel the same way about the Democratic Party. It's a means to an end, but I think a movement is based on something bigger and deeper and more idealistic. That's just my feeling, but I also feel that when people get too attached to a political party, then they're ready to trim their hopes and expectations and beliefs to the party rather than aiming for the higher ideal. So if you could say something, anything, let's say to the baby boomer generation, which includes me, by the way, just as way of closing, I like to think I'm younger and cooler looking than Bernie and Jeremy too, by the way. But if you could say one thing to that generation, my generation, that frankly screwed the world up for you guys, sorry about that, what would it be?
I would say don't limit your hope, and don't limit your expectations of what's politically possible by what you think is pragmatic, because as we can all feel really deep in our bones, we're in a huge moment of change, and you don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen, so we get to choose what happens.
I think, Julia, that is an absolutely fantastic thing to say. So I'm totally with you on that. And as I like to say, don't let the pragmatic get in the way of the possible. So,
Exactly.
Julia Mead, thanks for writing this piece, and thanks for coming on the show. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Me too. Have a good week.
You too.